I'm Cindy Quinlan. This is my friend and colleague, Maranatha Sweet. In the last decade, over 47 states, along with Washington, D.C., have passed some law to encourage elements of science of reading in the education system. Because the phrase science of reading is now being heard everywhere, many educators are coming to us asking, what is the science of reading? If that is what has brought you to this session, then you'll be able to walk away with a basic understanding of the science of reading. Other educators come to us knowing the science of reading, but not as familiar with the Abeka reading program. This session will help you walk away with a deeper understanding of how effective our program is. Because we have different teachers and educators coming to us with these questions, I have asked Maranatha Sweet to join me for a discussion on this program. So Maranatha, as we dive in, tell me, what was the beginning of the Abeka reading program and how has it brought us to today's conversation with the science of reading?
Well, as you may or may not know, the Abeka materials started with the Hortons, Dr. and Mrs. Horton, starting a Christian school in the 1950s. And when they did so, they needed to choose what they would use for instruction in the classroom for all the elements, particularly for reading. And they chose phonics because they knew phonics worked. There were already some of these other methods very common at the time in the 1950s, but they chose not to follow the fads. They chose to go with what was tried and true, which is consistent with one of our Abeka pillars. When they did that, they didn't have any of the underlying science or explanations of why the method worked. It's taken many decades for science now to kind of come around and bring us to more of an understanding of what's happening inside the brain. But what it's given to us now is that calm assurance that what we're doing works. And today, now, we get to talk about how what we've been doing matches up with, in many ways, this body of research that has come out with the science of reading.
I was just looking at one of my resources on this topic. It's published by bellwether.org, and it has divided reading instruction for the last several hundred years into 4 components. It labeled the earliest component as early phonics-centered reading instruction. It indicates that it began as early as the 1600s, still persists in various forms. Then it jumps to whole language. Then it jumps to balanced literacy. Then, according to this timeline, we have arrived at the science of reading. But as I was telling Maranatha just a little while ago, what I find is interesting is I would in many ways say that science of reading is establishing and in many ways emphasizing the importance of returning to some of the principles that we saw in early phonics-centered reading instruction. So I don't see those two elements as just different sections, but in this resource, it indicates that the early phonics-centered reading instruction was good with its emphasis on phonics, but that its problem was that there were some weaknesses. So I was reading through it. What were some of the weaknesses that were being promoted in the early 1600s, 1700s, 1800s? And it really didn't have anything to do with the approach. It really just had to do with some of the content in some of those early readers. So that would be a discussion for another day. But I like to say, rather than, hey, how does Abeka line up with the science of reading? I like to think the science of reading has finally caught up with the principles that Abeka has been using and promoting for many decades. So we keep using the term science of reading. Let's talk about what is the science of reading.
Yes, and before we jump to that, I did want to add in there is that when we consider the Abeka method and the way that was used prior to these other methods becoming popular, what the scientists have done when they came in and they figured out what's happening is they have used many very specific scientific terms. That's needful in a science research setting, that they can define each integral component of it. With that has come quite a new vocabulary, but you won't see that present very much in the Abeka phonics, because what we understand is the children don't need to know the vocabulary in order to be effective readers. So we keep the very simple practical language inside the classroom so that any teacher can follow the plan and teach their students how to read, but they don't need to be using the scientific terminology that was very necessary inside of the research setting. So
That
yes.
does bring up a good point, because when people do come us with questions about the Abeka reading program and the science of reading, they're looking for those terms, phonemes and graphemes and orthographic mapping. And our scope and sequence is going to include some of those terms like digraphs. But if I sound like I'm speaking Greek to some of you, that's the reason we don't necessarily include it in our day-to-day lessons, because our teachers don't need a master's degree in phonetic instruction or in literacy in order to teach students to read well. And we know, again, going back to biblical principles, parents shouldn't need a master's degree or an advanced education degree to teach their students to read. So while the inner workings of the brain, the way the Lord designed it, are complex indeed, we're not saying the reading process is simple. The way to teach reading can be simple, and that has been one of our goals for the last 50 years. And that's something, like you said, that you'll emphasize. As we talk about the science of reading and some of the complexity, we're going to contrast that with some of the simplicity of the Abeka reading program.
Which is a beautiful part of our program. So as we begin to consider the science of reading, the first thing that I looked at was, where did the research come from? Who was involved with that process? And it's quite a span of individuals from the fields of cognitive psychology, communicative sciences, developmental psychology, education, which should be obvious, and special education, as well as implementation science, linguistics, neuroscience, and school psychology. And I bring all of that out to say there's a wide range of individuals that are involved, and because of the different fields that they come from, they're all going to be bringing some of the specificities that they need in their field. For example, someone in special education is going to be considering how to communicate to children with special needs, as opposed to someone perhaps in a regular classroom. They are able to use what you would say the average student's needs are met with. So it's something that knowing who put together the research helps us to understand a little bit about it. The other thing I like to point out is that another one of Abeka's pillars has to do with our biblical worldview. And you will find that the scientists are not necessarily coming from that worldview. They may not agree that God created people and gave us the gift of language, and therefore that because of the way God created us, that our language is something that can be decoded and understood, and that it's something that we're designed to be able to do. It gives a different understanding. Sometimes you can take the same body of knowledge or data, if you will, and interpret it differently because of your worldview. I shouldn't say sometimes, that really is always the case. But that helps us to have a little bit of a, not a caution, but just an understanding that the people contributing to this body of research are coming possibly from different worldviews, and we need to make sure we always maintain that filter for ourselves, not just to buy into any particular research because we know that there is going to be naturally a bias, and bias is prevalent everywhere. It's always present. It's something just for us to be aware of and to think through when we're considering something like this particular topic. So as I continue to think about that, another element to understand about the science of reading is what it is not, which would include an ideology or a philosophy. It is not a fad, a trend, a new idea, or a pendulum swing, although I think Cindy will bring out in a little bit that it can tend to be a little bit of a pendulum swing. It is also not a political agenda, and that has to be emphasized because when the initial research came out in the 90s, because of the particular political group that was in power at the time, if you could say that, there were other folks who were unwilling to receive it or listen to this research at all because they were not of the same mind politically. So it is important to note that it wasn't a particular political agenda. It's also not a one-size-fits-all approach, and I think that also can be highlighted as the example I used earlier of special education versus inside of a classroom with average students. You know there's going to be some specific things that need to be adjusted based on the needs of your students. It's also not a specific program of instruction, which is something that's been interesting as it's come to our attention by talking with other educators, that there definitely seems to be a sense that the science of reading is a program that you can go on Amazon and order, if we can use that as an example. And then the last thing, it's not, and this is important as well for our discussion, is that it is not a single specific component of instruction, such as phonics. When I originally began to prepare this presentation, I had titled it Abeka Phonics and the Science of Reading, but that's really just one component of it. And when we get into the details of it here, you're going to see that phonics is, yes, a very important part of it, but there are many other elements inside of our overall program that will contribute toward the success of our students in their reading.
And if you're listening to this session, you're probably familiar with what we would call the reading wars. Maranatha mentioned it a little bit. It's not a political stance, and yet there have been reasons why, even though a lot of the research came out decades ago, it's only just now beginning to be mainstream, because for different reasons the research was compartmentalized or ignored or given lip service but not given application. And she knew I was going to make a comment, because as we've talked about this topic quite often in the last several months, I always want to emphasize that while it is not an ideology or a philosophy or a trend, it's beginning to act like one, or really people are beginning to treat it like one. In fact, because I like to do a lot of reading, I was reading an article, actually just a blog post by Amina McLean, who's a fairly well-known Australian language and literacy expert. And she stopped using the term science of reading 4 years ago in 2020. She says at this point it has become meaningless. It's so ubiquitous that it has lost its meaning. What exactly does it mean? She emphasized, you're right, there is no SOR curriculum, because SOR is simply a body of research. So we do want to emphasize that it really is just scientific evidence that talks about the knowledge and skills that students need to read. It talks about how reading proficiency develops, and then it says because of that information, we can conclude that these strategies work better than other strategies. At the end of the day, that's simply what it is. So when people start coming and say, but is this SOR aligned, and is this SOR aligned, you get the sense that it's become more of a platitude, it's become more of a rebuttal of just a phrase that at this point has no meaning. So that's why I wanted to emphasize that aspect, because we're not here to say, let's tell you how the Abeka reading program aligns with the science of reading, as if the science of reading were a plumb line against which everything else must match up. No, it's just finally we have developed enough technologically that we've been able to see how the brain physically learns to read, and we're able to support the cognitive science, or we're able to support the reading that we've been doing with these cognitive developments. And so we're excited about it, but at the same time, beware of just jumping on the trend. Acknowledge what is useful and put aside what is maybe more just trendy.
And I think just to kind of highlight, when Cindy is talking about SOR, she is referring to science of reading in shorthand.
Yes,
the way
thank
we
you.
so very often do. We develop acronyms for everything. And what our goal is for all of us is to have confidence that we are doing our very best to teach children to read, because we want in our Christian schools for our children to learn how to read the Bible for themselves. There's an ultimate goal that drives our purpose, and we want to make sure we're using the very best methods possible with that. So as we dive into the weeds, we talked about who developed the research. Now we talked about what the science of reading is not. And then I want to share with you this graphic that came from a researcher named Scarborough, who kind of tried to develop a visual of the whole
Really
reading
the complexity
method.
of
Yes,
reading.
the complexity of it. So if you were to take a close look, there's a lot of detail in this image, but you'll see that there's two main elements of this rope that's being woven together. One is language comprehension, and the other is word recognition, and then those are broken down into specific elements that we'll kind of trace through as we continue our discussion. But as those two wind together, they lead a student toward the skilled reading, or we would say fluency, which is of course our ultimate goal for our students, to become fluent in their reading skills. So it's a really helpful tool, as most visuals are. There's a reason we developed them, to really try to communicate a certain idea. So this one is becoming quite popular to help understand all the complexities.
And then when we go into the science of reading, what helps most people understand it, there are basically 5 parts. So tell us what those 5 parts are.
So it's a quick overview, and then we'll take them one by one. The 5 main parts would be comprehension, vocabulary, fluency, phonics, and phonemic awareness. And we probably reverse that and read it from the bottom up of the pyramid. I've also kind of given some ranges of grades that we would begin kind of laying the foundation for these in the Abeka materials, that, well, we can say this is when we specifically address it. We can't really say this is the limit for any of these particular components, but definitely working on the phonemic awareness in preschool up through 2nd grade. Phonics starts in K4 up through 2nd grade as an intensive instructional time frame. Fluency from the time they begin reading in K4 up through 6th grade, really just because that's when we finish what we would consider learning to read, although we certainly pivot to reading to learn in 3rd grade. But we're still working on our students improving their skills of reading up through 6th grade before we enter junior high, when they get into more of literature studies and that kind of thing. And then vocabulary, it's very hard to encapsulate when we begin and end teaching vocabulary, but certainly you could say preschool up through 6th grade. And then comprehension, also very difficult to limit, but I've designated as K4 through 6th grade of the time frames. In other words, we're really working on the reading skills from this time they start at school all the way through their elementary years, and we definitely would say it continues up through.
Correct.
We're just limiting this as to the elementary when you're learning how to read.
And certainly if you looked at secondary resources, you would see that emphasis, especially on vocabulary and comprehension, with the idea that those first 3 elements have been established. But what is interesting is, if you've done even some preliminary examination of the science of reading, you have seen these 5 elements. They're what is most commonly accepted as making up the science of reading. But they were actually coming from way back in 2000, when the National Reading Program, which was established by, when the National Reading Panel, which was established by Congress in 1997, did its research, and in 2000 published its research, it considered these the 5 essential components of reading instruction. Now, back then, the phrase science of reading didn't exist. Instead, what they used was scientifically based reading research programs, or SBRR. So it is interesting to note that while most people would equate science of reading with the last 5 or 10 years, a lot of the key elements go back even further to 2000. Now, I bring that to your attention because just because a program has these 5 elements, or claims to have these 5 elements, does not mean it's an effective reading program. Another prominent educator, Lisa Motes, way back in 2007, and that is way back for some of you. Some of you were still in elementary school at that time. But she had an article that I printed off here called Whole Language Hijinks: How to Tell When Scientifically Based Reading Instruction Isn't. And she emphasized the fact that despite the findings that were published by the National Reading Panel emphasizing the phonics instruction, the phonemic awareness, the vocabulary comprehension building, despite that, many whole language programs not only continued to exist, but they flourished. And her article here says, why was it that so many educators were fooled into thinking that a whole language reading program was actually scientifically based? She said, well, first of all, some people wanted to be fooled because they were so indoctrinated with the whole language method that it was still their preference. And though a reading program might give lip service to that scientific evidence, the fact that it still went along in the whole language method was what they were comfortable with. But the other thing, and this is the main point that I want to emphasize, is that you can oversimplify these 5 elements. And that is what this author was mentioning. Just because these 5 elements appear somewhere in a reading program does not make that reading program scientifically based. Instead, some people will have too much of one element and not enough of the other, or some programs will introduce them rather disparately or in an isolated manner instead of weaving them all together. So if you just look at this as some sort of checklist, you're not going to necessarily have a good analysis of how effective the reading program is. So keep that in mind even now when you're looking at those programs that are considered aligned with the science of reading. Ask yourself, who was doing the analysis, and were they doing it looking at the whole component? Because an effective reading program will contain these elements, yes, but it will also contain these elements in a well thought out manner. Just recently I was reading an article that talked about a group of teachers who were so excited about the science of reading, but then they spent too long on phonemic awareness to the detriment of their students. So if you have a program that doesn't teach these in a systematic, in a structured, in a sequential manner, those students still aren't going to get quality reading instruction. So you're looking for a reading program that has these elements, but that includes direct and explicit instruction of these elements. You're looking for these elements being in a structured, sequential, systematic way. I love saying those words over and over because they really emphasize that everything works together. And not only are you looking for an effective reading program, you're looking for teachers who know how to use it. Because we know, we have 50 years of evidence behind us how effective the Abeka reading program is. And yet, if it is not used well, then you're still going to have students struggling to read, even if they're on the Abeka reading program, because of perhaps teachers who are not familiar with it or who are not aware of how to implement it as well. So you're looking for these 5 elements, but you're looking for these 5 elements brought together and used beautifully, and you're looking for teachers who are trained in knowing how to teach the curriculum that brings these together. So that is kind of my little soapbox that we got on. But you know, we understood that this was going to be a long session. So for your sake, we've divided this into parts. Well, let's consider this first part just that preliminary introduction to the science of reading, to some of the bringing in of the Abeka reading program. In our next part, we are going to jump into that first element of the science of reading, phonemic awareness. You're going to hear what it is, and you're going to see where in the Abeka reading program we bring that out.